Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, peace to you all, and welcome to Office Hours. I'm Professor Adnan Husain, and I'm with you for this weekly live stream drop-in where we take your questions, your comments, and discuss, sometimes just with me, although I haven't been willing to face all of you completely alone yet so far, but it may happen in the future. I've instead had the wonderful experience of bringing on guests for this like kind of open live stream engagement with you all. And that's no exception today. I'm really excited. But before I introduce my wonderful guest and open up the conversation, I should just first thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to have these live stream opportunities for more engagement. I really have been enjoying the community that's being created through these sessions. But also, if you can, like the video, if you're watching on YouTube, and share it on social media. If you're watching on X, Twitter, please retweet the stream so that others can participate and enjoy the conversation. Also, if you can and want to support the channel so that we can make more recorded content in addition to these live streams and so forth, you can go to patreon.com/Adnan Husain. But I would like to emphasize, as I usually do, that I'd much rather you give to people who really desperately need it in Gaza. I want to highlight Lifeline number 4, Gaza.com, as a wonderful site that collates from various other sites to help prioritize those who have not had support or donations, so that you can get contributions to those who are most in need. So lifeline4gaza.com. Please do check it out. And in the meantime, of course, also share the stream. I'm really delighted today to be able to welcome a comrade who I expect to learn a great deal from, and I'm sure you're also going to as well. And that is Lara Shihai, who is, I say, a radical psychoanalyst, but is technically a clinical psychologist and a research fellow at the University of South Africa. You may have come across her work with Stephen Shihai, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine. But what we're here to talk about, in addition to previous work, is also the direction that her work has taken her in the future, and talk a little bit about the kind of work that you will hopefully get to read soon in the in the coming year, a book that's forthcoming, From the Clinic to the Streets: Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures. Lara, it's so wonderful to have you on. Thank you for joining on Office Hours.
Thank you so much for having me, comrade. I really appreciate it.
Well, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while because I am really interested in this question and problem. And you've kind of characterized the general topic we should think of as psychic militancy. And as a reader of Fanon who has been interested in some of the other components beyond what we think of as just the material workings of economy and the military occupation and the way in which power manifests in these kind of very direct material forms of oppression. I've also always been interested in the techniques of resistance psychologically and mentally, and also what the damage is done through colonialism on colonized peoples and their kind of mental sort of health and so on. And so I've been really interested to have a chance to talk with you, particularly about the work that you're doing, and also some of the ideas that you've developed out of your recent experiences. You shared an article and I posted it. Hopefully some people had a chance to take a look at it. That is I think a really fascinating, I mean, obviously, I'm really disturbed and upset that you had to go through what you went through, but I'm also very encouraged and really in awe at the way you took an experience of being the object of Zionist, attack into a way of really rethinking the way settler colonialism is working from a psychological kind of perspective and a critique of these professions and institutions. So I'm wondering if maybe you might tell us a little bit about this article that you published about the experiences that you had. That is titled, if I can get to the title, Intent to Harm Settler Colonial Outposts in Psychoanalysis.
Yeah, thanks for opening it up there. I think this is kind of the place where I started to think about psychic militancy in a really distilled way. So all of us now know the drill, and we know the logics of Zionist smear campaigns, and I think it felt very surreal. So the smear campaign that was lodged against me by AstroTurf organization Stand With Us, which now, I think in the last year, the previous year to 2023, it had filed like maybe 6 Title VI complaints, which are complaints with the Department of Education of the United States around national origin or ethnicity. And of course, they're talking about Zionism and being Israeli. But they had filed, I think, like maybe 6, and then by 2024, they'd filed upwards of 80. So we can see what they were greasing their wheels on and the logics of this. And so they filed it in early January 2023 in the Department of Education. At the time, I was a professor at George Washington University. And my university did something that now is very commonplace. But in January 2023, remember, this is pre-genocide, pre all this sort of there was still some valence towards liberal values and, our institutions and higher education being a space of critical inquiry. I mean, those of us who've been studying this for a long time know how ridiculous that was. But there was still some investment, like outwardly, in saying that. So within a week of Stand With Us filing this, the Department of Education is the only adjudicating body of these sorts of claims. And most of the time, these things get thrown out. So when I was talking to folks who had had this happen to them, prior to me, and a shout out here to some amazing people, Just Pierre Poir, Stephen Salaita, people who have been through this, who were like the first people to reach out and say, we got you. What do you need from us? So just such generosity, and shows you a kind of solidarity, but also shows you that this is not a new game for Zionists, right? So a week after Stand With Us, which, by the way, AstroTurf, right-wing organization that works with the settler colony, the Zionist entity, and believes in settlements. And so it's a right-wing organization. This should have been just completely ignored by the university. Instead, what the university decides to do, which again is now commonplace, is hire an external investigator to investigate these claims that have been completely fabricated in this really horribly written piece. If anybody reads this, you just look at this and you're like, we spend so much time being so meticulous about our work, about how we write things, about how we document things. And then these people like shit on a piece of paper, and then the university takes it seriously, right? So the university hired an external investigator, and this external investigator had like an Israel branch within it. It's a big DC firm. And so it became very clear that this was a campaign, and a campaign with an intent to harm, which is where this, title came from. So I realized very early on that despite the fact that I knew what reality was, despite the fact that I had more than 200 pages of emails documenting, this sort of surveillance by the university, by my program, the targeting of me by, a few students, that I had started to really struggle to keep focused on what was happening. And at that moment, immediately, I was like, there's something else that's happening. And it started to sort of make me think about how these campaigns, or Zionism, or any settler colonial regime, like the theft of the psychic terrain is central to its expansiveness. Because I knew what was happening. I'd studied this. There's an entire chapter in our book that talks about how people do this. I know the game, which is why I had so much documentation, because I know how Zionists work. And still, I was like, I need to stay focused. I kept telling myself, I need to stay focused. I could not, for a moment, slip or lose sight of the structural issue that was happening, because I realized that that would make me, number one, individualize this struggle, which it was not about. Yes, I was a target. Yes, there are many reasons for that. Assistant professor, young, Arab. It's really easy to do that. I was feisty on Twitter. You know, they used all of that. But the bottom line is that they make examples of people to have a chilling effect. And again, I was not the first person. So I really started to think about number one, how does this happen? How do structures and logics like settler colonialism and imperialism, all these things, how do they make themselves into our interior? And then how do they like settle there? And I started to realize, wow, this is the same logic of expansionism by land, of course, and theft of land and all of that. And I started to realize, of course, I study Fanon. I'm a Fanonian clinician. I was like, we have lessons about this. And then I started to really become serious and take very seriously the study of what was happening. I became almost obsessive about tracking what is the actual logic that's unfolding. What are they trying to have me engage in? How are they trying to conscript me? What are the ways in which the field is trying to conscript me as well? Because settler colonialism doesn't work on its own. It has to conscript others, right? Actors to do its dirty work under the guise of liberalism and all that. So I think that that's where this really started in earnest. And then, of course, by the time October 2023 came around and the genocide was in full swing, it became even more urgent for me to be like, there's something larger happening here. And we are being invited, seduced, really, at every turn for us to leave our revolutionary commitments, our political ideals, and join the logic of settler colonialism, whether that's through defeatism or ceding space or ceding psychic space. I mean, we can talk more about that, but that's kind of where it comes from.
Yeah, I loved how you didn't just individualize, the perspective that it was somehow about you as a victim of and target of these attacks. Obviously, you were targeted by these attacks, but instead of kind of framing it in that way, you turned it into an object lesson for actual further analysis and illumination. And so that's a much more productive, way to resist, right? The situation. I'm sure, as awful as that experience was, going through it and having to deal with all of I mean, you were prepared because you've seen that this has happened before, but when it's actually directed at you, of course, like you're going to have all kinds of feelings and so on. But it seems like one way of responding and dealing with it that was more psychologically militant was to not make it just about you, but to use it to expose these larger kinds of structures. So that I really appreciated about this account that you have of it. But something else that you just said, I think, is also a really important kind of point, and I'd love to hear you a little bit more on this, which is about the conscripting of liberals. And this is something that's particular, not just, it seems, it's very important for thinking of how settler colonialism manages to maintain itself, but also how and why it is that the right wing always seems to be able to transform the situation when it targets, real leftists, real, people who are kind of combating the system and resisting, is able to draw in the liberals. Okay. And the liberals in Weimar, they capitulated and they went because like it's that, or it's like, socialism or communism or all these radical alternatives. And they collapse in that phase. And I think you did some interesting analysis about how and why that happens. Why, we have all these like, kind of Yale University kind of scholars of fascism and whatnot who have left and come to Canada and made a big deal about how they're not going to live under the Trump sort of thing. And they talk about the collapse of liberal institutions and so on. But they make it seem as if it's the fascists' power over them to undermine and destroy them. Whereas what you're showing is these professional and psychological associations, they collapse themselves. They conscript themselves. And so that actually has to really be understood. So I'm wondering, maybe you can elaborate a little further on how that works, that the liberals go over.
Yeah, of course. Let's start first with, you were saying like they believe in their liberal sort of, that's the starting point, right? And I think this is the thing, is that if we want to speak psychoanalytically, we can talk about identifications. That liberals primarily identify with these civilizational discourses around liberal humanism and about fairness and about law and order and all these sorts of things. The right wing and fascists do their dirty work for them, but primarily there's an actual belief and an investment in somehow these institutions being able to be the spaces in which our liberation is fought for, in which these things are thought through. I'm not saying there isn't space to produce knowledge. You and I, like, that's the world we live in. I'm not saying that isn't the case. But when you really come down to it, I think the identification with these spaces as being the primary space of action is why they're primed to close ranks with fascists, right? Because when you start to have revolutionaries in your ranks and dissidents and people who are militant, we see how quickly liberals are much more likely going to fight to excise the militant than they are to excise the fascists. They will do everything in their power to stabilize and rehabilitate a fascist, to ask you to dialogue with them, to say that this is against free speech. And if we start canceling the fascists, then they'll start canceling us. And I'm just like, that's already happening. What are you talking about? So there's all these hypothetical ways. But I think if we look at it psychically and analytically and psychoanalytically, it reveals an identification that in all intensive purposes, you can't make the full identification known, because you're actually, and this is how white supremacy works, of course, you're invested in goodness. And that's the bottom line of a liberal. The liberal wants to look good and feel good and wants all of us to join in that feel goodness. But in the end, structurally, is unwilling to change anything. So when revolutionaries and radicals come on the show, they show up, it's like, you're asking me to actually shake up something, dismantle a lot. I mean, we've had this sort of conversation where people are like, it's about privilege, it's about that. No, but it's about ideological coherence too. It's not just about privilege. It's not about ceding just privilege, because there's many ways that we see how systems will expand and will cede privilege, will cannibalize themselves, as long as structurally nothing is being dismantled. And I think that's at the heart of liberalism, which makes it easy, I think, for them to join. Now, the other thing that I will say is racism is involved. It's not by chance that Palestine becomes the entry point for a lot of this. In psychoanalysis, I will say also anti-trans issues, transphobia is the closest thing that I will see to Palestine. It's the same logic where like everything will collapse. But Palestine has a special place. So just like the university, Palestine becomes the entry point where everything else that the university already wants to do is anti-labor, anti-worker, they want a contained population. They want you to be able to think critically within the lines, within their product that they're producing, within their own brand. Anything beyond that, we know how the university acts around that. So if Palestine is the entry point, that's the surest way you are going to have people, just like post 9/11, when there's all this racism against Arabs, and people sign on, and by people I mean liberals sign on to surveillance, liberals sign on to a taking away of civil liberties and civil rights, because it's worth it to them to snuff out the terrorists. I will give up my freedoms, quote unquote, right, and my investments and identifications in that, if I can be certain that the stealthy Arab, the stealthy Muslim, is no longer here. And I think that's what I was seeing in psychoanalysis, right? There's this email that I reproduce in this, where the steering committee, who categorically said Lara's not allowed. They barred me from presenting at a conference, even though I'd been part of this organization for a long time. And they say not only that we cannot contain the affect that might come up, which is already racist enough, but they also say if anti-Semitism didn't exist in the world, then Lara could. And it's like disappear the Arab. This will fix anti-Semitism.
Well, that is, really the structural logic, isn't it? I mean, this is what we've been learning and discovering, is that the mere presence of Palestinians asserting their humanity, and thus that they deserve human rights because they are human beings, actually. And so, merely the assertion of that has been characterized and interpreted now as some kind of psychic harm to Jews. It's a threat, as the simple presence of the Palestinian as a Palestinian saying, I am human and I deserve to be treated as such, is somehow a violation of the privilege of the settler colonial. So what you're pointing out as the logic of the supposedly we have to be cautious, we have to protect, we can't contain what might happen, and as a result there's a security problem, a security question, and so then we have to evacuate and evict, exile, expel the Arab that whose presence could cause all of this disruption and reaction.
And is already causing that psychically. Like, it's a confession. I didn't even have to present. Like, it was just the mere fantasy of this Arab, who is not only anti-Zionist, but also
people are really enjoying your earrings. For people who listen to this afterwards and don't watch, go find the video, because I think you'll enjoy.
So what was I saying? I was saying that not only, like, this is the thing, is like the Arab who is not only anti-Zionist, but quote unquote anti-America and anti-capitalist. Number one, 3 of those things, absolutely I am, and nothing to be ashamed of, right? But that mere fantasy shakes things up so much that they have to contain the future, which is a settler colonial, right? It's about it's about disappearing the presence entirely. And we're seeing this in Palestine. Like you said, Leanne Simpson, who's an indigenous scholar, talks about presencing as a psychic refusal of indigenous folks to disappear. And I think this is where I started to be like, there's something psychically happening that reproduces these settler colonial logics. When there's a psychic collapse that happens, the second these people even can imagine somebody coming in to speak about something. What I was going to speak about, by the way, hadn't even been decided. It was like, and this is the other thing that I want to say about the racism, the sexism that's involved in it. That's the other thing that I immediately saw, is that there's an infrastructure of anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab racism, of course, and anti-Muslim animus. And then there's also sexism that's involved, and how quickly that was mobilized. I mean, the heinous things, not only that trolls would say, but these are psychologists, these are psychoanalysts. Like, you don't even believe your own theory when you're like thinking about the ways that this works. But it was mobilized so quickly that I really, again, this is where the psychic militancy, I needed to remain clear on what was happening so that I wouldn't despair, so that I wouldn't be conscripted into identifications of like, and so I wouldn't discipline myself. Like, I would get emails being like, can't you just apologize? And then maybe they'll invite you back. And this invitation, mainly by white women, by the way, this invitation to docility, this invitation to temper oneself down, to temper one's position down, to not remain militant, that was the most disturbing thing to them, that I refused to back down. That when that email was sent out, the email was sent out by the executive committee and didn't name me. It just said, we're not going to allow this person because we can't contain them. And I sent an email back saying, I'm the person you refuse to name. And this is who you're speaking about. Like, you can't even give the dignity to actually name somebody. But that is part of the white supremacist and settler colonial logic. And I think abusive also, because I've said this before, abusers want to do their work and expect that people will not name the abuse that's happening. They expect that people will be disciplined through our socialization and through all these sorts of things and the psychic weight of that. The expectation is that this person's not going to say anything. She's going to be too scared. She's going to be afraid to. So it was really a practice that I got into about how to do that, and then really wanted to analyze the mechanics of that too.
Yes, I wanted to come and talk a little bit about the mechanics of that and how it worked, but I also noticed that you call it settler colonial outpost, which kind of was an interesting and it initially it didn't make sense to me because it wasn't like a physical territorial outpost. I mean, because these are widely these nodes and networks of Zionist propaganda, political pressure, and so on in, say, the North America or the West, function in a way that is very extraterritorial, as it were. It's like a transnational network that has obviously coordination in some respects with institutions and offices that are part of the Israeli government. I mean, they actually have an outreach office that, for example, like Asa Winstanley actually documented how the campaign to bring down Corbyn had, some material support, logistics, etc., that, came from the Israeli embassy. That's not always so clear a smoking gun. There's this like wider network. But I didn't think of it as like an outpost. And so I wondered if maybe you might tell us a little bit about why you chose that way of kind of thinking about this smear campaign as kind of reproducing settler colonialism, and maybe clarify that a little bit before maybe we talk a little bit about this mobilizing the psychic state of siege, which I think is just really important in the way that discourse works and operates at a psychic level, as you've been showing.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to do that. I think I was thinking about, particularly psychoanalysis. I think people might not think about the field. That's partially the field's the field's problem, because it's more interested in power than it is in being relevant, and so it kind of kicks itself out of any sort of relevancy in general for people to think about it. But I was thinking more along the lines of like settler colonialism being an expansionist project. And to do that, it needs to occupy as many spaces geographically, but also conceptually and sort of in fields. And so, I mean, we know that fields have been targeted, but I think this instance was the first time, I mean, it shook psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysis in the United States is quite small. And I'm talking about applied psychoanalysis. I'm not talking about the cool stuff that happens academically. I'm talking about an applied psychoanalysis. Some people are academics, many are not. They're practicing clinicians. And so this spread like wildfire. And what happened was you started to see the infrastructure that was already there. I mean, it just completely, thanks, Jay. That's from Jay. I owe that to him. My camera, folks. It's a gift from Jay. Much appreciated. So that's, I think, the outpost, is that also to see that it kind of works in twin settler colonial conditions. It's not by chance that this is taking hold in the context of the United States, but also to think about the ways in which Zionist ideology is expansionist in and of itself, and its goal is to expand. It finds a easy space to fall when it's already in a settler colonial condition that's primed for that, right? So I think that's kind of how I was thinking about it. But the other piece is that our psychic space is also that the becomes an outpost. And I think I wanted to mark for people that these smear campaigns don't work if there isn't a space for, I mean, they might work in as much as they certainly harass people. I'm not saying that I wasn't harassed. I mean, I had death threats, rape threats, threats of deportation, threats against my family. It was awful. And also the space, the terrain on which it lands, it's meant for us to take it in whole and become the outpost. Then we become the vessel that holds the logic for settler colonialism, whether it's through silencing us or disciplining us or making us back off. And I think this is where the psychic militancy comes from. Is like, how do we counter these attempts? How do we remain antagonistic towards them rather than naturalizing? Because Zionism and settler colonialism as an expansionist project, the point of it is to naturalize it and make it an uncontested space. And so that's the outpost. Like when you put up an outpost, in my thinking, outposts are also at some point supposed to become part of the actual geographical terrain. And then people start over time to forget that this wasn't how geographically this was. This is how checkpoints, of course, work. This is how the reconfiguration of this settler colony in the context of the United States, when you drive around, you just think this is the way that it looked. And you start to internalize that topography. And that was the point for me. It's like these smear campaigns are trying to reorganize a particular topography externally, but also internally.
Yes, yes. Well, the other resonance of outpost to me was the so-called illegal settler outposts, right? It's like as if all of them aren't
Yes,
illegal.
exactly.
They're all illegal,
Exactly.
But these ones that are kind of testing the boundaries and attempting, very much as you were saying, extend the sovereignty of the
Right.
Zionist
Exactly.
colonial settler state. And that's in some sense, what you were talking about is colonizing these discourses, colonizing these institutions, and colonizing the psyche. That you're suggesting we need to find ways to resist that, and it just reminds me that point. And we had a previous comment that had been about hoping that we would talk a little bit about how this can be resisted. In fact, it was net, yes, but all of this is happening under enormous pressure.
Yes.
But also had said, I hope we can talk a little bit about, for people who aren't as aware and practiced and with expecting, how the Zionist smear campaigns might work if you're suddenly facing it, how to respond and how to deal with that situation. And so it was a different one from net. Please also focus on some counterpoints that can help people who are not ready to cope with these pressures and didn't face these accusations before. If you suddenly, because you are expressing your solidarity with the people of Gaza suffering a genocide, if you call it out as a genocide, if you go to protests and marches and you are feisty on Twitter, which I think is a wonderful thing. Everyone should be feisty on Twitter or Instagram or wherever they are, be feisty. But that then suddenly then you may become the object of one of these settler colonial outpost attempts, in whatever sphere you're in. So what is, this psychic militancy? What would psychic militancy kind of teach us about what you can do to resist that? And I think we don't mean, of course, on the legal level and all that institutional stuff, but the psychic kind
Yeah.
of, how do you make sure this doesn't paralyze you?
Settle.
Yeah. So what would you say to that?
Yes. Number one, I would say that that's the intent.
Yeah.
And that, I think that's a bit, it might seem so small. But again, if we're thinking about, number one, how ideology works, it's meant to be seamless. It's meant that it becomes normative. And so for us to name, and I think this is why I wanted to think about this and write this piece, is the intent is to settle in our interiority. And not just settle, is to reconfigure what our interiority looks like so that we're confused. I mean, this is where Fanon comes in when he's like in Wretched of the Earth on Violence, first chapter, calls people who kind of, confusion mongers. He's very clear on that our world is filled with confusion mongers. And so number one is for us to be like, there is an intent here. There's nothing innocent about what is unfolding. There's nothing innocent about these attacks. It might be easy for us to say that when it's a Zionist smear campaign and be like, this is clear because it's so crude. You can be like, okay, the intent here is to silence me. The intent here is to hurt me. But naming that is an actual practice. And this is what I would say. It's a political practice. Psychic militancy is a political practice. It's not an individualized, like, let me just sit here and reflect on this or do some sort of introspection and then magically it happens. Because I'm not also thinking about the psychic terrain as being somehow a pure terrain that if we could just get this shit out of us, that we have this like pure place to go back to. No, I mean, if we're careful about the study of capitalism and all these things, we know that this is about the psychic space is always in relation with the external world, and we're imbricated in these structures all the time. We're always being invited into this reconfiguration of our internal space. So I'm not saying there's a return. To the contrary, I'm saying it is a daily political commitment that we make to remain clear on all the forces that might be working on us and through us. This is what Fanon might call disalienation. And it's a willful practice. It's not an unconscious practice. Part of that is doing it with comrades. Part of that is committing to a cause. It helps. And that becomes our guiding framework, right? Exactly. Don't isolate, but also be in the habit of naming these. This is what I was saying before, is that for me, this happening to me, it would be like, yeah, okay, this is happening to me. Oh, that's expected. Number one, it's not. These systems of power are as arbitrary as they are pointed and target people. But also the daily kind of walking through of how the mechanics work and what we're meant to actually do to feel despair. And this is what I've talked about before, Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, with Jay, about like commodified despair. It's meant to take these affect states and produce something with them. It derails our movements. It makes us confused. It makes us scared. It takes us away from the actual goal, which is liberation. In this case, it's the full and total liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. Anything that disrupts our focus on that is a good clue for us that there's something that's being mobilized with intent to do this particular thing. Now, again, there's all these infrastructures that work with it. We've talked about psychological operations and propaganda campaigns and all these sorts of things. But I think to recognize that it's happening, to name that it's happening, this is not a small thing. It might seem so simple, but for us to be in the practice of saying this is happening and this is why it's happening, because settler colonial logics actually rely on our psychic state of siege to be able to exact their full violence. Because if you are stopped up psychologically or affectively, it's a sure thing that materially you are also going to cede a lot of space, right? Whether that's because you're tired or not sure or worried about what this looks like socially or aesthetically or any one of the things we're socialized into. Remember, we're socialized into politeness, into like not rocking the boat, into being afraid about that we will look like the feisty one or the one that's constantly talking about this. And so it's almost like a muscle for us to like gain stamina around. The last thing I'll say is to remember that, and this is where Fanon comes in, where psychoanalysis comes in. That's why I use psychoanalysis, is that things happen in patterned ways. And so for violence repeats itself in patterned ways, in a logic that we can start to read. And then it becomes us also responding with the repetition, with the force of the repetition that's needed. And so even if we keep coming back to the most basic things over and over and over and over again, right? History, how things repeat themselves. These are not empty gestures. They are ways that we refuse the reconfiguration. And that repetition becomes actually incredibly important psychologically, because this shit is really strong and insistent, and it wears us down. So the repetition also has to be just as forceful.
So basically, we need psychic exercise, basically, to build up our
Yeah,
stamina, resilience, and strength.
yeah.
Because,
I mean,
you know,
militants practice
yeah,
every day, they commit.
that's it. Well, it reminds me, I mean, you've referenced Fanon a couple of times, and in the article, you also quoted something that I recall very vividly from that first chapter of Fanon on violence in Wretched of the Earth, that the colonized subject fights in order to put an end to domination, also ensuring that all the untruths planted within him by the oppressor are eliminated.
Yes.
So that's the point, is that the normalization that you're talking about does run deep. We've been subjected to so much psychological
Yes.
warfare, training, forming, and something that you said also just rings so true, is that it is very uncomfortable
Yeah.
to go against all of that and to put yourself in opposition, sometimes alone, in a lot of these institutional spaces and
Mhm.
communities, in your job, in your school, in your kind of religious community, in your civic organization, to be alone against the complaint. It's not that everyone would be opposed, but they're complacent and they fear the disruption.
Yes.
It's an uncomfortable experience they also don't want to experience, so they don't come out in solidarity with you when you put forward, hey, don't we have a moral and ethical and political obligation to condemn what's happening as an
Yeah.
organization, or participate in some way in resisting a genocide it immediately puts you in the position of being the person who's making everyone else feel uncomfortable, and that's an
Yes.
incredibly uncomfortable feeling. So there's so much pressure like this,
Yes.
you know?
Yes. Yes. I mean, this is part of, I'm in the final stages of finalizing this book, and there's this wonderful speech by Malcolm X in Paris in 1967. And he says, somebody asked him a question about, Mr. Malcolm, you are advocating for an extremist movement in the United States. And, in characteristic psychic militancy that he shows us, he says, if we are extreme, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says something like, if we are extremists, we're not ashamed of it, because what we've been subjected to is extreme.
Yeah.
And we can't fight that ill with tepid medicine. And that's the thing. It's like psychic militancy is also about leaning into the extremism, right? And I'm putting it in quotes, like, we're the ones who are called extreme, but again, the repetition to be like, to name clearly and remain connected to material reality. This is the actual reality principle of psychoanalysis. It's not just the psychic. Freud talked about the reality principle. Fanon's the one who goes at the reality principle hard. Everybody else seems to have fucking forgotten that reality principle is one of it. It's not just about intrapsychic stuff. It's about what is actually guiding reality. And that's the point, is to say, if we're extremists, it's because the structures that saturate and encapsulate our life are ones that deal in extreme violence. And so how do we expect that any response would dismantle this that isn't itself extreme? And that's what I would say also. If you are the extremist in the room, it's because you know what's going on.
Right. Yes. I mean, seeing reality is dangerous.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's the difficult, and that's why it's so much easier to delude ourselves, to accept the propaganda, and so on, because then your path is made so much easier. But of
Yeah.
course, that's absolutely stultifying for your mental health in the longer
And,
term. I mean,
yeah.
this
And
is
then we're back to liberals.
that's right. So this is, we don't want to be liberals. We want to be liberated.
Yes. Yes.
Liberate ourselves. I mean, this is I think, a really important kind of point in conversation. Before we continue, I just want to remind everyone, have you liked this stream? I mean, let other people know. It'll get on the algorithm. More people who really need this is the kind of information, analysis, perspective that is just really giving me such a lift to hear. And I'm sure for many of you, and I'm noticing in the comments and the audience, are finding this very fruitful and useful. So share it. Be generous. Be a generous comrade. Don't just be somebody who likes to be in the know because you heard all of this wonderful stuff and now you can, share it with your friends later. Let them in on it at the early stage. So share the stream, like it, retweet it if you're watching on X. Okay, but so getting back to this kind of question here, it reminded me a little bit also the Malcolm X point. I mean, I love Malcolm X because he's like the embodiment of all of these things, of psychic militancy, of anti-colonial, radical. There's a lot of people who theorize, but he had a way of really putting it into kind of more actionable language and exemplifying and embodying the resistance. Because one of the big, of course, problems, there's a lot of people who've written about it, colonizing, decolonizing the mind, because of course, one of the most dangerous things of being in the colonial condition is this inferiority complex, all the things that Fanon was saying that have been normalized and placed into the colonial subject that have to be purged and eliminated. But he said something interesting also about anger. And I noticed that in in at least one of the articles in your discussion, I think it was about Fanon's and the unreality principle, he also in a different speech said that after his travels through Africa that was undergoing decolonization struggles, anti-colonial resistance, during that period in the 60s, early 60s, when much of Africa had not been freed from colonial control and was engaged in that. But there were a few places that had managed to free themselves. Ghana, Algeria was involved in that struggle right at that time, and had just received its freedom from France. He said that everywhere he saw that the places progressed where people got mad, and everywhere where people just got sad, they remained, under colonial domination. And he was urging people, you've got to get mad. And you were referring to Glenn Coulthard's concept of politicized anger.
Yes.
And so I was wondering if maybe you could talk about some of the because anger is always talked about as a destructive, psychological orientation that's bad for you have to deal with anger by trying to overcome it and put it aside. It's not productive. Whereas, these radical thinkers were talking about something that was clearly much more productive, and it didn't turn them into bitter people who, couldn't engage with comrades and enjoy life and be these cripples emotional. No, it was something else. So I'm wondering, what you might say about thinking through the affect here.
Yeah. I mean, so this is a good in vivo practice of psychic militancy, is that for us to track anytime there's a prescription by, and usually this comes from the psi disciplines, by the way, and psychological disciplines primarily, right? That anger will poison you. And when it starts to become part of a larger program about eliminating a prescription, about eliminating something, it's a good clue for us that there's something happening, and for us to ask the question about what other infrastructure is this easily sort of put into and channeled through, and what effects is it asking for, right? So I like that you brought up Coulthard, because he also calls it like disciplined resentment. He's talking about, in the case of indigenous folks, particularly in the settler colony now known as Canada, about recognition, state recognition, and being sort of in the politics of legibility by the state. And the idea, and using Fanon, he's talking about how these concessions that we make around legibility are always predicated on eliminating your righteous anger about the originary cause of everything that we see, and that's genocide and theft and dispossession and displacement. Now, we see this, of course, in the context, in vibrant colors in the context of Palestine, like you were saying before, that any time, a indigenous people or an oppressed people, whether it's they take up arms or express anger against their oppressor, there's always a disciplining function that happens. So that's the return back, is when there's an ask for us to eliminate an affect entirely, and this is always what's asked. Now, it's also deeply racialized. We don't have to go very far to talk about, how Black folks are always asked to leave their rage at the door, and particularly Black women. This was also used against me. She's so angry. There's this entire fucking piece written by this stalker academic called Lara Shihai's Joyous Rage. So that's the racism and the gendered component that's also always at play. So it's a clue for us. If there's an affect that is always being determined as always already too much or too disturbing, there's a likelihood for us to think structurally and say, what is it that this thing is disrupting? And anger is a disruptive force. It's a force that is a force of refusal. It's a force that's also one about no compromise. You can't compromise with anger, especially if it's related to one's dignity and one's right to liberation, one's right to autonomy, right? And I think that's why it's always the first thing that people ask. When you think about these dialogue efforts, like come to the table and talk, all these sorts of things, there are immediately all these rules that are involved in it. And people will say, but we really have to speak politely to each other, and there's no space for like affect and anger. That's a clue for us about what the potential transmutative force of this affect is. And to hold on to that with a disciplined resentment that Coulthard talks to. Because the disciplined resentment is one that says, the project of liberation is not yet complete. Why the fuck wouldn't I still be angry? Why would I not be angry? In Palestine, why is not every single person entitled to an anger that lights up the sun? Because the project is not done. Total liberation is not yet here. Why would I preemptively give up the life-sustaining force that reminds me against the efforts of erasure, of confusion, of all of that? That's why anger is so important. And it doesn't, you're right, it doesn't have to be destructive. I think that's a story that we were sold and internalized, right? Because we've said this before, that if you're fighting a revolutionary fight, and this is Che, of course, that it's about love and tenderness and all that. And anger is not that is not an opposite affect. Our self-help industry has positioned it as like love and hate are opposites. But Erich Fromm was a psychoanalyst who was talking about like hating Nazis, and he has a whole piece called On Hate and why we should hate to actually like psychically remain sort of coherent about what our goal is, right? But again, it's an example of these things that we might just become casual part of everyday life. It's so toxic. Hate is so toxic. Okay, if it's an individualized hate that's sort of maudlin and sort of self-indulgent, okay. But what if it's connected to a cause for liberation and reminds us who the actual oppressor is?
Yes, hatred of injustice.
Yes.
I mean, if you have a certain kind of ethical and moral temperament, it's just intolerable to see such injustice and oppression, and you just hate it,
Yes.
I mean, so yeah, I think this is really interesting. One other thing is that we've had a few interesting comments that perhaps, with some questions that maybe we might take up a little bit. And firstly, I just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for the vibrant discussion that's taking place and people really engaging. I love seeing this building of a kind of intellectual and political community through this. And so please do share and like the stream so that others may learn about it and join into this conversation. And I want to say, you referenced millennials are killing capitalism, and you've done several wonderful discussions with Jay on that. And so people should, if they don't already subscribe, check out those videos and subscribe to the channel. And also, I just want to also give a shout out to Resistance is Fertile, who I believe are doing a lot of the work that we're talking about today, trying to do it in their videos and online content. And Benji's, I think, in the house. He's been making some interesting remarks and comments there. And I think, what psychic militancy is something that they've coined over there as the psychological support front for resistance. I mean, that's what this militancy that you're talking about and training to, develop this is really interesting. I can't find the specific question I wanted to ask you. I'll come back to it and find it in the chat. But there was another point that I was thinking about when I was reading your work and thinking about this kind of problem. And I put a bunch of questions in the description that were just sort of, anything that I could think of that related to how one is dealing in this moment with the kind of psychological damage, of having to feel like you can't change, and stop this genocide. But I was thinking about in this kind of psychic militancy, some of the things that you're talking about and that we were just addressing are things that I would think of as psychic defense, like how to make sure you don't take on board, defend yourself from the psychological warfare, from these toxic discourses, or the ones that attempt to normalize and make, what should be rejected as utterly, abnormal, should be totally abnormal aberrations into normalcy. So there's some component of this as psychic defense. And then I was thinking, well, what's the counterpoint for a psychic militancy that impels to action, and that's why I was thinking about anger. And so I was thinking about what might be related to psychic defense is maybe psychic defiance. It's like, how do you kind of express and mobilize? They've mobilized the psychic state of siege. How do we mobilize something that's counter to this, that actually can break these sieges, and so that's what I was kind of thinking about. What would you think fits into this kind of category, if it's a worthy category at all? It's just I'm throwing out there, of psychic defiance. What does that look like?
A force field. But for real, and I think this is part of it, is that I love that you brought up psychic defense, because I think in common parlance and sort of in mainstream conversations and in the, mainstreamification of psychoanalysis, you think about defenses as being pathological. We are taught to think that if we have a defense mechanism, and this is what happens, is that those are by and large pathological, and that if we talk it out and introspect and all that, there are ways that we can adapt and function better in this world. And my position is psychic militancy is about fortifying those defenses, actually. It's about understanding that actually those defenses, they try to be overridden, and psychoaffective states within us are mobilized to demobilize. So this idea of I'm really playing in this book, in this upcoming book, really about wrenching psychoanalysis from the overlords, the hands of the overlords that have created this entire nomenclature and method and grammar that would tell us that somehow fortifying ourselves against these intrusions makes us somehow less functional or less reasonable. And this is the part where I love Fanon the most, where he comes in and he's like, I mean, this opens up one of my chapters, actually, the chapter about psychic militancy, where he has this essay that he writes in Al-Mujahid in 1957 called, once again, The Reason for the Precondition. And he says, no amount of reason is going to change how colonialism works. And so our position always has to be the precondition. The precondition is total liberation. If we leave that, if we move away from that, even slightly, we've lost the goals for liberation, right? And that's what I mean about a force field. Our force field is actually a seizing of these ideas that somehow this is pathological, a turning it on its head and saying, actually, this militant defense is what it's need. We need a barricade. Because of the barrage of what's coming, we need to constantly be fortifying these defenses. We can't be doing it individually, right? I think this is why it's part of political practice. And I think more and more our movements are certainly becoming aware of the psychic terrain, if nothing else because of how the wear and tear happens. But I think integrating the psychic defense into our political strategies has to be part of what we do. This is what I mean about understanding this happens in patterned ways. This isn't accidental that all these campaigns and Hasbara and propaganda and psyops. I mean, Jay's in the Ori talks about this, Dylan Rodriguez talks about this, about psyops. And as I'm like researching for this book, I'm seeing all these psychoanalysts that were architects of psychological operations because they understood how the mind worked and how you mobilize it in particular ways. And so for us, it's about really seizing that and saying, okay, if this is how this was created with this particular intent, what does it mean for us to actually hold the line and practice that militancy and fortify our defenses and not be ashamed of them and really, right? And it's not to be an asshole in our relational space. I'm not saying go do that with your family and your comrades and your friends. That's the place where we get to regroup and feel everything. But when we're on, and we're on in terms of our struggle, which for me is always, that's the point, to have sort of laser focus around this and really lean in hard to it and understand it as if this is warfare, then part of the guerrilla warfare is the psychic part.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, in my own way, I've been trying to explore some of this. I'm not a psychologist. I'm intrigued, and I think it has so much importance. I've been exploring it, of course, more with the resources that I have within, Sufism, and trying to kind of think of how that tradition can be mobilized and has, in fact, actually has a long history of having been mobilized for anti-colonial resistance in West Africa and Southeast Asia and so on. But, ways where, I mean, this, you mentioned before that it's just so enervating and wearing, kind of having to deal with these settler colonial outposts, these smear campaigns. That's when it's most intense. But all the time in daily life, there is this practice of trying to make normal, the genocide, the oppression, etc., and make us feel atomized and helpless. And so it just is exhausting to try and work against that. And so we really do need some resources in one way or another to keep us in the struggle for the long term and continuing. So that's just my sort of comment on that. But another thought came to mind from a comment here, Azabache Zapata. How does that having to deal with traitors, collaborators, compromised, and normalizers affect us psychologically? And I think that's a general kind of question or a
Yes.
problem.
Mm-hmm.
But specifically, I was also thinking is that we have a tendency, well, I've noticed, and perhaps it's just because I spend too much time on the cesspool that is Twitter, X, and on social media, it's that there are a lot of occasions where somehow we lose focus on how to be comradely
Mm-hmm.
and solidaristic in the struggle while still maintaining principles
Mm-hmm.
and critique in a way that isn't anathematizing allies.
Mm-hmm.
But we often sort of turn to this language of traitors, collaborators, even among our community, that is resisting. Obviously, we have to be able to have serious critique with one another and be able to do that in a fashion that doesn't put people under, a sense of, uh, um, that they've been somehow deemed heretics and ejected from the community, but yet also holds one another to account
Mm-hmm.
in a spirit of prioritizing the cause of justice rather than individual
Mm-hmm.
interests and egos. And so it's so complicated. And I see so many of these kind of battles that create fissures rather than solidarity. And part of it is because you are dealing with real traders and collaborators.
Yes. Yes.
And also at the same time, that language is there for any difference that you have within your movement to just take it to that level. And
Yeah.
so I'm wondering, how does one think through these very difficult
Yeah.
experiences in the struggle and from a psychically militant
Yes.
standpoint?
Yes. Hence the practice. It takes practice to remain precise around these things. And it's to remain precise because it's a different type of discipline, right? This is why it's political, because that is a seduction as well. And when you sort of dilute what these things mean, the only way it can go is to detract from our struggles, right? So I think that's number one. But the idea was like, how does that impact psychologically? And then I'm going to go from there and then move into what you were saying is that it's hard to feel betrayed. And I think there is a betrayal. And I think that a lot of times I'm in conversation, whether I'm in conversation with organizers or students, or there's a way in which over and over and over again, I'm told how surprised people are that the power struggles of our world find their way into our struggles. And that's our reminder. It's like this stuff saturates our life. The difference is that as leftists and as radicals and revolutionaries is we have responsibility to take it up and be accountable when this stuff reproduces itself. But so number one is not to be surprised, because if we take seriously that these things are deeply within us for a reason, and that we're socialized and conditioned into these spaces, when they show up in our spaces, the element of surprise, I think, really siphons off a lot of psychic energy. So this goes back to like the patterns, is to understand that things work in patterns and to have strategies around this, like you're saying. Now, here's the piece that helps is if things work in patterns, and somebody in a patterned way keeps doing something, okay, maybe but you're right. I think people make mistakes. And I think if we are serious about building a movement and a struggle, there has to be mechanisms to account for and sort of shore up and be able to hold space for certain growth that happens, that we do it together, right? And that Jay's saying about contradictions, all of this sort of stuff that's our work, that's our struggle, that's what struggle is about. And it's like solidarity through struggle. We struggle. This shit's not easy, right? Relationally, it's not easy. I think that's where the precision comes in. Like, again, if somebody keeps doing something, I think it's okay for us then to be like, to then disidentify from this part that I also see. Is that a lot of times, I think because we're so used to this idea that somehow all leftist endeavors are failures, which I don't believe. I'm not a pessimist leftist at all. I think every struggle has been a building block to the next one. And I think that if the entire state is against us, it's very easy to see everything as a failure rather as like actually wrenched from our hands and made impossible, right? Revolutions are made impossible. They're not failures in and of themselves, right? So, but it's to say that like along the way, we learn also that not everybody's going to come along. And I think holding on, I think sometimes because we read things as failures, I've seen that people also feel like they have to hold on to structures that fall apart, or people that might actually say things like this happened recently, somebody who people respect in the psychological field came out and wrote a letter that says like normalization and BDS are not sacred principles. Like that's clear. If somebody says that, we're clear on where they stand. That's our clue, right? And that would be the place. I think people rush to hold on to those sorts of people because they're worried about fracturing. But the fracture, if we can think about it as a constant struggle, fracture is also space for redefined and honed positions, right? And for us to be able to learn from the current moment and not get stuck in the trap of like being nostalgic about a particular moment that's already passed. That's the point. I think that's why I also like psychoanalysis, is like it's constantly in movement. These things are psychoaffectively dynamic. So it's always holding on to this contradiction. I'm naming a contradiction. It's sort of being like careful about the ways in which we make space for people to make mistakes and work through their contradictions. And that's not going to be everybody's role. I'm just going to say that. That's not going to be everybody's role. You know, somebody in Gaza right now doesn't have fucking time for you thinking about, you know, do I do BDS or do I not do BDS or whatever the case is. And I don't think anybody's doing that. But so that's the other piece, is like, what are our particular roles in the struggle and how do we deal with this? And then the other part of the contradiction is like, yeah, there are going to be a lot of people that get left behind. And I think people are struggling with that. I think I hear a lot of people saying like, there are so many relationships that I just no longer have. And I get that. And also on the flip side, can we attune? Because we're always primed to attune to the losses, to the failures, to our surprises. Can we attune to the spaces in which the relationships that we are building have also deepened and have become actually part of that force field we were just talking about? That I feel more clear than ever about who's willing to go to total liberation with me. And that's actually very relieving, rather than like the minefields that we're constantly traversing. Obviously, I'm not talking about liberals here. I'm talking about actual people who might have come along for the ride, and then they have limitations. And it's like, that's on us also to be like, okay, this is the limitation here. And then psychologically to kind of deal with what does that end up feeling like when people that you might have invested a lot of psychic and affective energy in can't go all the way with you.
Yeah, and I think that's been especially difficult in this period. I mean,
Yes.
as you've been mentioning, I mean, there always were these issues and contradictions and so forth that you would find and discover in the course of struggle before. But I do think that this has had, as you're pointing out, a clarifying role. And it has been polarizing in the sense that I think it has activated a lot of people, to really embrace and identify with Palestinian solidarity and resistance in a way that, of course, for people my age is absolutely shocking. I mean, I remember it being a very lonely, to be advocating. Well, I'll tell you the loneliest moment that I had in my life, actually, in a way, I feel, was at UC Berkeley when I was in grad school and the Oslo Accords were announced. And there was so much like celebration. And I knew this was like just not going to lead to anything other than subcontracting out the occupation, and relieving Israelis of the appearance that they were occupying Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, by now putting a Palestinian face on it, because the conditions under which this was
Yeah.
developed. But it was impossible to say that, because nobody would accept the idea that I mean, the only option was you had to be like a total terrorist, I mean, what were you committed to if you weren't like happy that there was this process and a chance for
Right.
so-called peace? And so that kind of experience is difficult. And it's ratcheted it up, I mean, in a way more now, because I think the lines are clear. There is a greater sense of solidarity, but it's also the experience of many people that you can't tolerate certain people in your life, now. Whereas before you might have just had to, or you just did, but now we're facing,
Yeah.
open genocide. But the other side of it is that it also seems to have activated and polarized people on the other side, in the white supremacist, settler colonial cause, the, white identitarian West, like that level where the right wing, has bought the kind of idea that Israel is an emblem of Western hegemony and white supremacy that they are unwilling to give up, and that in fact, actually, it has clarified for many of them what the stakes are,
Yeah.
and it has impelled them into action on the other side in a way that I also had not ever seen before. Like there are a lot of people who are sort of middle of the roaders who have realized, my commitments are with, I mean, I don't think there's as many as people who have been pushed by the reality of what's happening, but it is interesting that it has had this kind of polemicizing
Yeah.
kind of effect, because it's clarifying, where do you really stand? What are your real commitments? And in a way, that's sort of a relief, because now we know going forward
Yes.
what
Yes.
we have to do, who's going to be with us, who's not. It's like
Yes.
become much clearer.
Yes. And in many ways, it's like, were they ever middle of the roaders then? Right? Because
They were
they could
allowed to be.
hide.
Yeah.
They could hide in that. But that's the point. And I think we're seeing the end point of a very long project. A Zionist, expansionist project, settler colonial project. This is how it can happen. But I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but also not, because infrastructures are built over a long period of time so that they can jump into action when they're needed. And this will return back to those psychoanalysts. Like, you just, anybody who says the takeover of the illiberal left and they just needed a sacrifice of a white male, and like, I'm the head of that, army, that shit's, I mean, you're a psychoanalyst. That shit's not very below the surface. That I didn't implant that in you. This was part of your internal world. And this allows you the channel that justifies your ability to articulate these things, just like Empire did post 9/11. None of that shit about surveillance, about Empire's project, about reconfiguring the so-called Middle East, all these sorts of things, the, over militarization in the context of the settler colony, that stuff was there. It needed an opening, something to mobilize it in a way that becomes justificationist, and more people are on board. But again, it's like, in my view, it's like, you were never middle of the line then. You're good at repression, I guess. But that's not middle of the line. That's a hard stretch. And like any of the psychological operations manuals, I've talked about this before, they actually spell out that like militants are very hard to change their mind because they're committed to a cause. So they go for the middle of the line people to enlist them in making militants hateable. But those middle of the line people then weren't really, they were just like, oh, you're just kind of crypto-fascist already, but have some sort of identification with the goodness that separates you, no one moves that fast, that quickly, if you don't have that infrastructure deeply inside of you. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And Benji's posting here, this polarization is a feature of pre-revolutionary moments. So the point about it catalyzing,
Or smack in the middle of revolution.
I mean, well, that's the positive way to really
Yeah.
think about it, is just as you were saying, that you feel it's better, it's clarifying, and and that's the point, is that we're under the heat right now.
Yep.
And this is an opportunity where maybe something could change. I mean, we had, unfortunately, I mean, I always have to say, I love Lady Alex. She said, I don't think these millions of people are not waking up. I mean, well, that's true, but I do think there is a dynamic that is forcing them to have to deal with reality, their commitments in a different way, and that has political potential, for change. So what we have to be doing in these kinds of conversations is figuring out, what we can do in these moments ourselves to galvanize, a strong movement for change. And I do take hope that, as Benji is saying, polarization is a feature of pre-revolutionary moments. So something is distilling now. It's not
Yes.
going to be the same going forward. So
No, nothing's the same going forward. And hey, Benji, I get to join them soon on a
that's great.
podcast.
Yeah, people should go check that out for sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I had some other kinds of questions, that I don't know if they were well judged, but they're just the kind of thing that concerns me and bothers me during this time, of, um, how. So I guess maybe what I'm thinking about is, in addition to sort of psychic militancies, mobilization and defense, I'm also wondering kind of how you're thinking about it, as like a way to kind of defeat the deceits of liberal normativity, in like kind of consumer capitalism, because we've been talking about like those who are more politically active and engaged in this time of genocide. These things are very clear. For those who are still kind of, I don't know, it's hard for me to imagine because it's just not my mentality, but I'm not everybody, so I want to universalize from my standpoint and position. But I would say, like, there's such a great attraction to many to this liberal normativity.
Yes.
This is what I see among so many colleagues, and even people who you would expect, because they adhere to radical sort of critical theory in many ways, but in terms of it being a political practice, I think that's really where the disjunction is because if it isn't a political practice and it's just an intellectual kind of projection, it seems like you can be very susceptible still to norms of institutional kind of conduct, and the promise of liberal normativity is still there. How would you say, like, we need to analyze this and jolt people out into a more psychically realistic standpoint?
Maybe it won't surprise you. I'm gonna borrow from Sarah Ahmed here and say we need to be feminist killjoys. And that's part of psychic. It's like, don't let that shit slide. At every turn. I mean, if we think about the logics of settler colonialism at large, and I'm talking about like a logic of like disavowal, right? That's what it goes on. Reality bending, politesse, us being pulled into this. It's the same thing that consumerism and capitalism and all these sorts of things is an anesthetization to affect, to all of that. And then there are things that fill this void, right? And they're never, miraculously, they're never disruptive. They're never militant in their force or any of it. So I think it gives us a blueprint. It says that if anything else, part of what we do is not allow these processes to unfold without being antagonistic towards them outwardly. is like, let them never have a day in which they are not checked, they are not named. That's what I mean about feminist killjoy, is like, I'm the person always in the room that's just like naming a process as it's unfolding, because that's a political commitment, not because I'm just want to be the asshole in the room, but because I'm trying to practice what it means to understand an analytic that will always be in service of stabilizing racial capitalism and settler colonialism and imperialism, because that's how power works. And it enlists us all to do that. It enlists us all to do that with smiles on our faces and thinking that we're doing great work and reform and all this sort of stuff, right? So it's always a reminder that that is actually how this happens, and that like this is where we go back to Fanon. It's not a thinking machine. It's just invested in its own longevity. And so if anything else, being committed to disruption, just making it sure that these processes cannot happen without being named and can't just seamlessly start to become part of the regular, normalized process of everyday life. And I think you're going to see people squirm. People squirm. People just want to like get on with their day. And it's like, but that's part of it. And that's for me. And I'm like, we're living in a time of genocide. Nothing should be allowed to unfold without being challenged. Nothing should be allowed. No one should be allowed to go through a day without being disturbed and disgruntled and pulled out, even if for a microsecond, from the anesthetization and sterilization of their everyday life that capital insists on. And that's the thing. I mean, it's also a practice. Sarah Ahmed talks about it. It's like a willful practice. You do this, and you start to sort of recognize about the power of speaking this into. And I'm not saying be pedantic. I'm saying you are this. That's what I mean by studied. Is like, these are the patterns that unfold, and what is it that stabilizes this course, and what allows it then to like constantly have to reconfigure itself. Power recalibrates, period. It's going to be fine, folks. Power is going to find a way to recalibrate itself. What do we do together? Now, if that's a political strategy with comrades, even better. But like you said, sometimes we're alone in that. So I'm just like, I'm not going to let you have a good day.
Well, it's interesting.
That's the clinical intervention, folks.
Okay. Carpe Diem says, but Laura, I really do not want to be Kamala.
Absolutely.
We have to offer up some joy and fun. Like,
of course.
Children making music against a drone. Of course, your
Absolutely.
vision mean there's no.
No, of course not. That's why I brought Che. Tenderness. Basil al-Araj, who talks about enchantment, about recognizing, the drops of rain, going on a walk and seeing, a spider web, and like being just taken by it. These are the ways, and this is not Pollyannish. This is about recognizing and fighting against the insistence that our life is just circumscribed by necropolitics and deathscapes. If somebody in Gaza can make music against a drone, that is an affirmation of life. There's still a beating life here. There's a weight, and that's not delusion. That's not deflection. That is a seizing of a weapon of destruction and turning it and saying, you motherfuckers aren't attuned to all the layers that are in this. But I am, just like we saw on October 7th, when that weapon of destruction turned, right? That tractor that demolishes homes broke down a siege. It's the same thing. It's alchemizing these things in ways that settlers can't understand because they can't attune to those textures of life. So yeah, singing is a part of that.
Nice use of the attune, because that making music with the drone was amazing. It was like
so moving.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, it just said this is resistant life.
Yes.
Cannot be squelched and stopped. And reminds me that there've been so many moments like that. Mm-hmm. And I know Nora Barrows Friedman on Electronic Intifada always tries to have some affirmation of resistance and life among the common people. They have the resistance report, but just the common people's daily
I mean,
affirmation.
she's a reminder herself, right?
She is, yes, she is, and it's wonderful. I mean, I love that part of it because usually, it's been 40 minutes of
Yeah.
tears,
Yeah.
and we have to remind ourselves, of course, that while we will disrupt, I think as Benji was saying, you do it where in the place where supremacy manifests itself, the
Yeah.
liberal normativity,
Mm-hmm.
relies upon a certain sense of supremacy that underpins it. That's where you go after it. So you have to go after it in those
Mm-hmm.
in those places. But like there are other places and spaces where you have to affirm life and joy, because that is also defiance, in the face of settler
Yes.
colonial attempts to make it so unbearable
Yeah.
that you cannot continue to resist. I mean,
Yes.
that's the positive part that we have to do. I remember seeing a wonderful. I'm a bad learning oud player, and I saw one. There was a boy who was like maybe 14 or something, and amid the tents, he was playing the oud and singing. There was a circle of children around him, and it was so beautiful
Yeah.
because, again, it was again one of these testimonies to Palestinian people still being joyful
Mm-hmm.
amidst what they are suffering. And so,
Mm-hmm.
if they can continue to do beautiful things and show beautiful humanity to one another, for one another, how
Yes.
can we be despairing?
Yes.
Right? How can we be despairing?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's our duty not to be. I've said this word, like wajib. It's our
Well,
duty.
yes,
Yes.
that's right. That's right. Well, it's been 90 minutes. Office hours is usually an hour and a half, and maybe just a bit. But we should probably give you a chance to maybe make any kind of final concluding thoughts. I hope that when the book is out in 2026, from Pluto Press, and people should look for the title, From the Clinic to the Streets, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures, that we can maybe have a discussion about some of the other techniques that you discuss in there, and have a continuing conversation. And hopefully we won't have to wait until 2026, but I want to say that I want to invite you definitely when the
Thank
book
you.
is out to continue the conversation and make sure that people get the book. But I'm wondering if you have any sort of concluding thoughts and advice for listeners about psychic militancy and how
Yeah.
we can be psychically militant.
I would just say thank you to you and to our shared comrades, and like that is part of it. I think having these discussions in a public facing way, externalizing things, if we're talking about the psychic intrusions of power settling within us, right? That part of an antidote to that is also a practice of externalizing, of refusing them to just kind of sit there and fester and just be alone in that. And I think these podcasts across the board, whether it's Sina or Justin or you or Jay or anyone, is that we are joining in those relational, showing people what it means to be in comradeship and to struggle through these things, because it's not like these conversations are easy. I owe so much to these conversations with Jay that have opened up so much, and they are very affectively laden, and they've pushed me in ways that I couldn't have done just in isolation, right? So that's what I would say thank you, and I would say really folks like this and you and people tuning in and joining in that and being part of a larger community is one way we practice this, especially as spaces slowly close more and more. And to divest from all those other spaces, like we don't need them, just like we don't need a lot of these academic spaces that for so long we thought we needed. We are now in a place where we've created spaces that can sustain this, and that's not being in an echo chamber. You're in a fucking echo chamber every single day in capitalism. It's like that's
Exactly.
what we're forced. This is your space to come and practice how we remain militant.
Well, those are wonderful words, and I think it's a big shout out to the community in the
Yes.
chat where there has been, uh, people conducting psychic militancy right here in the chat, as Al Qaeda says.
Fuck yeah.
Yeah, so that's important. Keep up these independent spaces for some community. That's why we hold these office hours and do it as a live stream so that we can engage with the chat, that you can engage with one another, because we need to reinforce, support one another in the practice of psychic militancy to make us stronger for the resistance that must take place. Not just resistance, we must win. And so we need to train hard. And it's been wonderful, Lara, to have you here
Thank you so
discussing these
much.
topics and sharing your wisdom and insight. Um, I'm really grateful. And so thank you so much for coming. Before everybody leaves, express your gratitude by liking this video and sharing it. So even if people weren't here for the live stream, they'll have the benefit of being affirmed and strengthened by watching it back later. So share it. And with that, I want to thank everyone for coming and see you again soon. Next week, I will be having Alex Avinia come and we'll be talking about what's going on in Latin America and US empire there. And soon after, somebody had posted, we need struggle sesh when we were talking about the self-critical kind of components. Well, we also will be having a struggle session happening on the 14th, Sundays, as usual, the once monthly live stream panel with a great group of guests, Jared Ball, Benji Schoendorf, who's been in the chat here as Resistance is Fertile, will be coming. Nora Barrows Friedman, who we were talking about, who's such a uplifting spirit for us all in the movement, will also be there. So come join that conversation as well. Until next time, solidarity and peace with justice.
Thank you, Kamran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.